The stagecoach rolled slowly through the narrow canyon, just as the first rays of sunlight painted the red cliffs of Red Rock Valley with shades of gold. Frost still clung to the tall grass lining the dirt road, sparkling like tiny pieces of broken glass beneath the morning light. The horses snorted clouds of white breath into the cold air, while the wooden wheels creaked against the frozen ground. It was the kind of quiet morning ranchers appreciated because silence usually meant another peaceful day. Caleb Dawson had already been awake for nearly 2 hours. At 35, he had become one of the most respected cattlemen in Montana Territory. Years of drought, brutal winters, and failed ranches had driven many families away, but Caleb's ranch had somehow survived every hardship. People often said the Dawson Ranch stood because its owner refused to quit, even when nature itself seemed determined to break him. He was repairing a loose section of fence when he heard the distant rumble of approaching wheels. Visitors were rare. Few people traveled this road unless they had a reason. Caleb rested his hammer on the fence post and looked toward the entrance of the ranch. The stagecoach slowly came to a stop beside the gate. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the door opened. A woman stepped down carefully, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. She wore a dark traveling coat covered with dust from miles of rough roads. A faded brown hat shaded her face, but Caleb recognized her before she even lifted her eyes. His breath caught. Emma Brooks. 13 years had passed since he'd last seen her. Time had changed her. Fine lines framed her eyes, and a few silver strands had appeared among her dark hair. But there was still something unmistakably familiar about the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. She looked older, tired, as though life had demanded far more from her than she had ever expected. Caleb stood perfectly still. For years he had imagined this moment 100 different ways. Sometimes he imagined shouting, sometimes turning his back, sometimes asking the questions that had haunted every lonely night. Yet now, standing only a few yards away from the woman he had once planned to marry, he found himself unable to speak. Emma slowly turned toward the coach. "Come on," she said softly. A young boy climbed down after her. He looked about 12 years old. His coat was slightly too large, his boots showed signs of careful repair, and he carried a worn leather satchel over one shoulder. He glanced around the ranch with wide eyes, taking in the endless pastures, the grazing cattle, the towering mountains, and the weathered wooden barns. Then his gaze settled on Caleb. Everything inside Caleb seemed to stop. The boy's eyes were blue. Not simply blue. They were the exact shade his own mother used to call mountain sky after rain. The same narrow shape, the same serious expression. Even the slight tilt of his head looked painfully familiar. Caleb's heart pounded harder than it ever had during a cattle stampede. He stared without realizing he was staring. The boy noticed. He offered a polite smile. "Morning, sir." Caleb couldn't answer immediately. His eyes never left the boy's face. Emma saw the realization beginning to form. She lowered her head for a moment before finally looking back at Caleb. "I know this is difficult," she whispered. His voice came out rough. "What are you doing here?" Emma hesitated. "I needed to see you. After 13 years." "Yes." He took one slow step forward. "You disappeared without a word. I know. You left me standing in front of a church where everyone expected a wedding. I know. You let me believe you chose someone else." Pain flashed across Emma's face. "I never chose anyone else." The words hung heavily between them. Neither spoke. Only the wind moved through the cottonwood trees beside the ranch house. The boy looked from one adult to the other, sensing emotions he couldn't yet understand. Finally, he stepped closer to Emma. She gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "My name's Noah," he said politely. Caleb managed a nod. "I'm Caleb. I've heard about this ranch," Noah said with a shy smile. "Mama always said it was the prettiest place she'd ever known." Emma closed her eyes briefly. She hadn't meant for him to say that. Caleb looked at her again. "You've talked about this place?" "Every year." "And me?" She couldn't answer. Instead, she quietly reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small silver pocket watch. It was scratched from age, but Caleb recognized it instantly. He had given it to Emma on the day he asked her to marry him. She had kept it all these years. "I never stopped carrying it," she said softly. Caleb stared at the watch before looking back into her eyes. Questions crowded his mind. If she had kept the watch, if she had remembered the ranch, if she had never married, then why had she vanished? What happened, Emma? She looked toward the mountains before answering. For 13 years, I've carried a truth that should have belonged to both of us. Caleb's jaw tightened. What truth? Emma looked down at Noah. The boy watched her with quiet trust, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. She gently squeezed his shoulder. Then she met Caleb's eyes. I didn't come back asking for forgiveness. She paused, gathering every ounce of courage she had left. I came back because he deserves to know his father. Silence swallowed the entire ranch. The distant calls of cattle faded into nothing. Even the wind seemed to stop. Caleb looked from Emma to the boy once more. His heart already knew what his mind refused to believe. Emma's eyes filled with tears. He isn't someone else's son, she whispered. He's yours. Caleb Dawson couldn't move. The words echoed through his mind as if the mountains themselves had spoken them. He's yours. For several long moments, no one said anything. Noah looked back and forth between the two adults, confused by the silence. He had expected an awkward reunion, but not one that left both of them frozen where they stood. Finally, Caleb managed to breathe. Say that again. Emma swallowed hard. Noah is your son. Caleb shook his head slowly, almost as though refusing to wake from a dream. That's impossible. I wish it were, Emma answered quietly. Life would have been much easier. His eyes remained fixed on the boy. Every feature suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. The same strong jaw, the same calm expression. Even the habit of folding his hands together while standing still reminded Caleb of himself at that age. He looked at Emma again. How long have you known? I discovered I was expecting about a month after I left Red Rock Valley. And you never told me? Tears filled her eyes. I believed you didn't want us. Caleb stared at her in disbelief. What are you talking about? The letter. What letter? Emma frowned. The one saying you'd change your mind. That you had decided marrying into my family would only drag your future down. You wrote that you'd accepted an opportunity to expand your ranch with help from wealthy investors, and that there was no place for me anymore. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. I never wrote any letter. Emma looked equally stunned. You didn't? No. For the first time in 13 years, both of them realized they had been living inside completely different versions of the same story. Caleb leaned against the porch railing. The morning you disappeared, your father told everyone you'd gone away willingly. My father showed me a letter supposedly written by your aunt. It said you'd fallen in love with a businessman in Helena and didn't have the courage to face me. Emma slowly covered her mouth. My aunt never sent any letter. Then who did? Neither answered. The silence itself became the answer. Someone had lied. Someone had carefully planned every step. Someone had wanted them separated. Noah stood quietly, trying to understand. So, you both thought the other one left? Emma nodded. Yes. Caleb closed his eyes. 13 years. Emma looked across the ranch. I cried every night for the first year. So did I. I waited for you. I searched for you. She looked at him in surprise. You searched? I rode halfway across Montana. Every address I was given turned out to be false. Emma's shoulders slumped. I never knew. No, because someone made sure you wouldn't. Noah finally spoke. Does that mean? He hesitated. You're really my father? Caleb looked at the boy. His voice softened without him realizing it. If your mother is telling the truth. I am. Then yes. Noah didn't smile. He simply stood there, overwhelmed by a question he had quietly carried his entire life. I always wondered, he admitted. Other boys talked about their fathers. Mama always said mine was a good man, just far away. Emma wiped away another tear. I could never bring myself to hate you, she said to Caleb. I tried, but I couldn't. Caleb looked down at the ground. I hated myself instead. The afternoon passed slowly. Emma and Noah were invited inside the ranch house. The old wooden kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Everything was simple but warm. Noah examined every corner with quiet curiosity. He noticed old family photographs hanging on the walls. One showed Caleb standing beside his late parents. Another showed him breaking horses years earlier. "You've always lived here?" Noah asked. "My whole life. I've never lived anywhere longer than 3 years." Caleb looked at Emma. She lowered her eyes. "We moved often." "Why?" "Because someone kept finding us." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated before answering. "I'll explain." She took a deep breath. "Do you remember Harold Mercer?" Caleb's expression immediately darkened. "The banker. He wanted to marry me before you did." "I remember." "He never accepted my answer." Emma reached into her traveling bag and removed an old bundle wrapped carefully in cloth. Inside were faded envelopes tied together with worn string. "I've carried these everywhere." Caleb picked up one of the letters. The handwriting looked familiar. Too familiar. Emma pointed toward one particular signature. "This is the letter I received after leaving." Caleb compared it with another letter she handed him. It was one he had written years before during their courtship. The handwriting wasn't exactly the same. It had been copied, imitated, carefully. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Someone practiced my handwriting." Emma nodded, and they became very good at it. Caleb slowly placed the papers back on the table. "Harold, I believe so. He had access to the post office. He also had money. And influence." Emma nodded again. "After I left, Harold appeared several times in the town where Noah and I were living." Caleb looked up sharply. "He found you?" "More than once." "What did he want?" "He always pretended the meetings were accidents." "But they weren't." "No." Emma looked toward the window. "He kept asking whether I'd changed my mind." Caleb's hands tightened into fists. "He thought eventually I'd marry him. And when I refused..." She looked at Noah. "He reminded me that a woman alone with a child had very few ways to survive." Caleb stood, so suddenly his chair scraped loudly across the wooden floor. "He threatened you?" "Not directly, but enough." Emma nodded. "I left every town before he could settle there." Caleb's anger continued growing. For 13 years he had believed Emma had abandoned him. For 13 years Emma had believed he had betrayed her. Meanwhile, the man responsible had quietly built himself a respectable reputation. Harold Mercer was no longer just a wealthy banker. He had become the county commissioner, controlling land records, tax disputes, water rights, and much of the local law through political influence. People trusted him, respected him. Few remembered the ambitious young man he had once been. Late that afternoon, the peaceful silence of Dawson Ranch was shattered by the sound of galloping hooves. A black horse raced toward the front gate. The rider pulled hard on the reins, stopping in a cloud of dust. Caleb recognized him instantly. Harold Mercer. His expensive coat was spotless despite the long ride, and the silver badge of county commissioner gleamed proudly on his chest. He looked from Caleb to Emma. Then his eyes settled on Noah. For the briefest moment, confidence disappeared from his face. He understood immediately. The truth had finally come home. A cold smile slowly returned. "I see," Harold said calmly. "So, the family reunion has already begun." Caleb stepped off the porch. "What do you want?" Harold adjusted his gloves as though this were an ordinary business visit. "I came to warn you." "Warn me about what?" Harold's smile grew even colder. "Some secrets are better left buried." Then he turned his horse toward town, leaving only dust behind him. Caleb watched him disappear over the hill. For the first time in 13 years, he knew exactly who had stolen his future. And he silently promised himself that this time, Harold Mercer would not win. The following morning, the peaceful atmosphere at Dawson Ranch had disappeared. Word traveled faster than the wind in Red Rock Valley. By sunrise, nearly everyone in town had heard that Emma Brooks had returned after 13 years with a 12-year-old boy who looked remarkably like Caleb Dawson. By noon, the gossip had grown even worse. Some claimed Emma had invented the story to gain ownership of Caleb's ranch. Others whispered that Noah's real father had died years ago, and Emma simply wanted security. A few even suggested she had come back only because Caleb had become one of the wealthiest ranchers in the valley. None of them knew the truth. But rumors rarely needed truth to survive. Emma sat quietly on the porch, staring toward the distant hills. She had expected whispers. She simply hadn't expected them to begin so quickly. Caleb walked outside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "They're talking," Emma gave a small, tired smile. They always do. He handed her one of the cups. I don't care what they're saying. I know. They'll stop. She looked into the steam, rising from the cup. They didn't stop 13 years ago. Before Caleb could answer, a rider approached the ranch. It wasn't Harold Mercer this time. It was Samuel Pierce, an elderly rancher who had been Caleb's neighbor since childhood. Samuel removed his hat respectfully before speaking. Morning. Morning, Sam. The old man shifted uneasily in his saddle. I thought you should know. Know what? Harold called an emergency county hearing. Caleb frowned. For what? Samuel sighed. He claims there's a dispute over the Eastern Creek running through your property. Caleb laughed bitterly. That creek's belonged to my family for 30 years. Everyone knows that. Then why the hearing? Samuel looked toward Emma. Because if Harold controls the water rights, your ranch loses nearly a third of its grazing land. Caleb understood immediately. This wasn't about water. It was revenge. Harold wasn't attacking the ranch. He was attacking the family. Samuel hesitated before continuing. There's something else. What? Harold's been telling people Emma isn't fit to raise Noah. Emma slowly looked up. What? He says a child deserves a respectable home, one without secrets. Caleb's face hardened. He actually said that. Samuel nodded. Not directly, but he made sure everyone understood. Emma gripped the coffee cup tightly. He wants to take Noah away. Caleb immediately knelt beside her chair. No, he'll try. He won't succeed. You don't know men like Harold. I know exactly what kind of man he is. Emma looked into Caleb's eyes. For 13 years, he's controlled this county. Not anymore. She wanted to believe him. She truly did. But fear had become part of her life. That evening, after Noah had gone to sleep, Emma disappeared into the small guest room, carrying her old traveling trunk. It was the same weathered trunk she had protected through every move across the territory. She carefully unlocked the rusted brass latch. Beneath folded blankets and old clothing lay a thin wooden panel. She lifted it. Hidden underneath was a small leather package wrapped in faded cloth. Caleb watched silently. You've been carrying this all these years. Emma nodded. I prayed I'd never need it. She slowly untied the cloth. Inside were several yellow documents. Old letters, receipts, a faded bank ledger, and one small notebook. Caleb carefully picked up the notebook. What is this? My mother's journal. He opened it carefully. Several pages described conversations she had secretly overheard before her death. One entry made Caleb stop reading. It described Harold Mercer paying a railroad messenger to replace letters traveling between Red Rock Valley and Helena. Another page mentioned Harold bragging that once Caleb and Emma were separated, neither would ever discover the truth. Caleb looked up. Your mother knew? Not first. Then how? She found Harold's discarded practice letters while cleaning the church office after a charity meeting. And she kept them? Emma nodded. She confronted him. What happened? He denied everything. Did anyone believe her? No. Why not? Emma lowered her eyes. Harold had already become one of the most influential men in the county. Caleb slowly turned another page. There it was. Several sheets of paper. One written in his real handwriting. Another copied almost perfectly. Only tiny differences remained. Enough for an expert to notice. Not enough for two young people blinded by heartbreak. Caleb quietly closed the journal. This is enough. Emma wasn't so sure. Will people believe us? They'll have no choice. The county hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. News spread across Red Rock Valley like wildfire. Nearly everyone planned to attend. Some came hoping for justice. Others came only to witness another scandal. Harold Mercer arrived first. He sat confidently behind the long oak table at the front of the meeting hall, greeting ranchers with the polished smile of a respected public servant. He looked completely relaxed. Years of authority had taught him never to show fear. When Caleb entered beside Emma and Noah, conversations throughout the room immediately stopped. Dozens of eyes followed them. Harold smiled politely. Mr. Dawson. Caleb didn't answer. The county clerk called the meeting to order. Harold stood. We're gathered today regarding a dispute over the Dawson Ranch water rights. before this hearing continues." Emma's calm voice interrupted him. Every head turned toward her. She walked slowly to the front of the hall, carrying the leather package. "I believe the people of Red Rock Valley deserve to hear another matter first." Harold's smile faded ever so slightly. Emma placed the old letters on the table, then the notebook. Finally, the bank receipt. This receipt records payment made by Harold Mercer to Thomas Wilkes, a railway courier, 13 years ago. Whispers spread across the room. Harold remained perfectly still. "A coincidence," he said. Emma ignored him. She held up 2 letters. The first was written by Caleb Dawson. She lifted the second. The other was forged. The county clerk compared both documents. His expression slowly changed. "The handwriting," he murmured, "is almost identical." "Almost," Emma replied, "but not completely." Just then the back door opened. An elderly man entered the hall, leaning heavily on a walking stick. The room grew silent. Caleb recognized him immediately. Thomas Wilkes, the retired railway courier. He slowly removed his hat. His hands trembled. "I've carried this shame long enough." Harold's confident expression vanished. Thomas looked directly at the crowd. "Harold Mercer paid me to replace the letters." Gasps filled the room. "I was young. I needed money. I convinced myself nobody would get hurt." Tears formed in the old man's eyes. "I was wrong." He pointed toward Harold. "He planned everything. He made sure Caleb believed Emma had abandoned him. And he made sure Emma believed Caleb no longer loved her." Silence fell over the entire hall. For the first time in 13 years, Harold Mercer had nowhere left to hide. But as everyone stared at him in disbelief, his eyes revealed something far more dangerous than fear. They revealed desperation. And desperate men rarely surrendered without one final fight. For several long seconds, no one in the county hall moved. Harold Mercer stood frozen behind the oak table, staring at Thomas Wilkes as though he couldn't believe the old courier had found the courage to speak. Every eye in the room shifted between the 2 men. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Harold forced a laugh. "You expect these people to believe the fading memories of an old man?" Thomas straightened despite his age. "I expect them to believe the truth." Harold's smile disappeared. "The truth," he snapped. "The truth is that you're trying to save yourself." "I've lived with this guilt for 13 years, Thomas answered calmly. "There isn't anything left to save." The county clerk carefully examined the letters once more before passing them to Judge Benjamin Cole, the retired circuit judge who had been invited to oversee the hearing because of the property dispute. Judge Cole adjusted his spectacles and compared every signature. His expression grew increasingly serious. Finally, he looked toward Harold. "Mr. Mercer, would you care to explain why your bank ledger recorded the payment to Mr. Wilkes on the exact week these letters disappeared?" Harold remained silent. The judge asked again. "This court is waiting." Still nothing. The whispers inside the hall became louder. Men who had once respected Harold now exchanged uneasy glances. Women who had defended his reputation lowered their eyes. One by one, people began realizing that the respected commissioner they had trusted for years had carefully built his reputation upon deception. Harold suddenly slammed both hands onto the table. "I did what had to be done." The room fell silent again. His breathing grew heavy. "You all think Caleb Dawson would have given Emma the life she deserved." He pointed toward Caleb. He was drowning in debt. His ranch was barely surviving. "I had money. I had influence. I could have given her comfort." Emma looked at him with quiet disappointment. "You never asked what I wanted." Harold turned toward her. "I loved you." "No," Emma replied softly. "You wanted to possess me." The word struck harder than any slap. Harold's face twisted with anger. "I protected you. You destroyed 13 years of our lives. I saved you from poverty. You stole Noah's father." Harold looked toward the boy standing beside Caleb. For the first time, genuine regret flickered across his face. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then he suddenly spun toward the door. "Stop him!" someone shouted. Harold pushed through the crowd and burst outside. Within seconds, the sound of galloping hooves echoed across the valley. Sheriff Daniel Harper rushed from the hall with 2 deputies close behind. Caleb instinctively started after them. Judge Cole raised a hand. "Leave this to the law." Nearly an hour passed before the riders returned. Harold sat handcuffed on the back of a deputy's horse. His expensive coat was torn. His hat was gone. The confidence that had defined him for 13 years had completely vanished. The sheriff dismounted. "He won't be causing anyone else trouble." Harold was escorted away without another word. As the jail wagon disappeared down the dusty road, a strange feeling settled over Red Rock Valley. It wasn't celebration. It was relief. An invisible weight the entire community had carried for years had finally been lifted. Judge Cole officially dismissed the false water rights complaint that same afternoon. The county commissioners voted unanimously to remove Harold Mercer from office. Every legal claim he had filed against Caleb's ranch was declared invalid. Then the judge addressed the final matter. Turning toward Noah, he smiled kindly. "Young man," Noah stepped forward. "The law recognizes what your mother has always known." He looked toward Caleb, "and what your father now proudly accepts." Caleb walked across the room until he stood directly in front of Noah. Neither spoke. Words suddenly felt too small. Slowly, Caleb placed both hands on the boy's shoulders. "I missed every birthday." Noah nodded quietly. "I know. I wasn't there when you learned to walk. I know. I wasn't there when you needed someone to teach you how to fish, or ride, or stand up after falling." Noah's eyes filled with tears. "I know." Caleb's own voice broke. "I can't get those years back." "You don't have to." Caleb looked at him. Noah smiled through tears. "We still have today." Without another word, Caleb pulled him into a tight embrace. The entire hall watched in complete silence. Many quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Emma stood nearby, crying openly now. For 13 years, she had dreamed of this moment. Reality was even more beautiful than she had imagined. Life slowly returned to normal over the following months. Noah settled happily into ranch life. Caleb bought him a spirited young chestnut horse that Noah proudly named Ranger. Every morning the two could be seen riding across the open fields together, checking fences, feeding cattle, and laughing like father and son who had known each other forever. Emma no longer carried fear wherever she went. The people of Red Rock Valley welcomed her home with genuine kindness. Neighbors who had once believed the lies apologized openly. She accepted every apology with grace, choosing peace over bitterness. As spring painted the valley with wildflowers, Caleb invited Emma to ride with him to Crystal Creek. It was the very place where, years earlier, they had dreamed about building a future together. The water flowed gently over smooth stones while the evening sun filled the valley with golden light. Caleb climbed down from his horse. So did Emma. For a moment, they simply stood together, listening to the peaceful sound of the creek. Then Caleb slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Emma laughed through her tears. "You always choose the most uncomfortable places." He smiled. "I guess some traditions are worth keeping." From his coat pocket, he removed a simple gold ring. "I can't give us back the 13 years we lost." His voice grew softer. "But I can promise that no one will ever steal another day from us." Emma reached for his hand before he could even finish. "I never stopped loving you, Caleb Dawson, and I never stopped waiting for you." She slipped the ring onto her finger. Yes, their wedding took place that June beneath the wide Montana sky. Friends, neighbors, and ranchers from every corner of Red Rock Valley gathered to celebrate the family that had finally found its way home. Noah proudly stood beside Caleb as his best man. When Emma walked down the aisle, she wasn't walking toward a new beginning. She was walking back to the life that had been waiting for her all along. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains that evening, Caleb wrapped one arm around Emma while Noah stood beside them, smiling at the endless fields stretching beyond the ranch. The valley felt peaceful once again, not because every hardship had disappeared, but because the truth had finally been stronger than the lie. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with gunfights or revenge. Sometimes they're won by people who refuse to let love be buried beneath deception. And in Red Rock Valley, after 13 long years, truth had finally come home.